Hey, hello everyone. Today we'll talk about AWS IAM Assume Role, what exactly that is and how it works, and we'll also see a demo. So let's get right into it. Uh, Before we start, I'm going to assume that everyone knows what exactly is AWS IAM and have some level of functionality about roles. So we'll take it from there. Thank you so much. What exactly this does, or what is the problem that it is currently solving, right? Why there is a need for assume role? We'll actually talk about what it is. So first thing is, what is the problem, right? So uh, whenever we are giving any user access to any of the resources, it obviously comes with a risk, right? So if you are giving access to the entire account, or to an entire service, all of them read, write, modify, access, all of that, it obviously comes with a risk, right? It has its own risk. And of course, if your username password gets compromised, or especially in terms of access key or secret keys, if those gets compromised, it will be a lot of problem, right? So that's what it is trying to this particular thing is trying to solve. It is kind of a based on principle of least privilege, and that is what it will help you to achieve. All right, why do we need this particular role? Obviously, it is one of the AWS security best practices. So again, the idea here is to grant limited access to certain resources for a limited period of time. Okay, again, the principle is for giving least privileges to the user so that he can do the job and not more than that. All right, so again, limited access to the resources, to only the resource that is needed, and only for the time that is needed for. All right, so whenever a user signs in, let's say an IAM user, all right, they will have a specific set of permission of the things that they can do and they can't do. Once they sign in, they can actually go ahead and switch their role. We'll see how that works, obviously. And this temporarily, basically, what happens is sets aside your original user permission and you get new permission for a new role. That's how Assume Role works. So again, as we mentioned, it is works on a principle of least privilege, and you give whenever whatever user has access currently, it is only restricted access, and then if he needs more to do some other things, then he would have to assume role. So I'll give you an analogy that you might have seen before of how it works, and this assume role kind of again works like this. So you must have heard about normal user and a super user in Linux, right? So we most of us have used Linux operating system, and whenever we want to, whenever you log into the Linux server, we use log in as a normal user, right? And then if we try to do something, let's say if you want to install something, like on the screen you can see there's a screenshot where we were trying to install apt-get something, or you want to just update the packages, it will not allow you to do that if you do not have the permission. For that, you go ahead and assume the role or switch your role to super user, right? You put the command sudo, and then what it will do, it will ask for a password, right? And then once it does, then after that you can actually run that particular operation. So similarly, uh, so the concept here is you have a user which doesn't have privileges to run certain things. He goes over or assumes the role of another user, all right, which does have the privileges. It provides the credentials, and then finally performs those operations, and after that is done, it returns to the normal user state. All right, that's how this thing works. Similarly, your assume role also works in the same way. So now in AWS, obviously there are a few differences of than what happens in Linux and how it works. We'll definitely talk about that. So let's see in which scenarios in AWS will it be used, right? So one of the scenarios would be, let's say you have an engineer or a deployment engineer or a dev engineer, anyone, all right, who is handling your multiple environments like prod, also pre-prod, and QA, all right. And of course we all do that right nowadays. So there is one development account and he has permissions on that, and there is a production account. So if he wants to go ahead and deploy something to the production account which he currently do not have access to, so he can assume the role for some time for the production account, and then for that time whenever he wants to deploy these things, all right, or deploy a particular service or update a particular service, any of the job, then he can go ahead and assume that role. He will get the temporary credential for that, and finally he will be able to do his job, and then after that he can return to his normal uh, IAM user state that he has. All right, now how actually does this assume role works? All right, what are the things that are behind that works for you, or that allows you to assume any role that you want? First of all, we take help from what is known as STS. So STS is your security token service, which is again a service in AWS that helps you to go ahead and uh, ask for temporary credentials. All right, that gives you temporary credentials to so that you can go ahead and do some things. Now, first of all, any IAM user, they log in with their original credentials, right, which they have been using for a while, right, and along with their permission, whatever permissions they have. Now, what it needs to happen is, first of all, the user makes a request, that is your STS Assume Role API request, all right, with some information. They make this API call, or they ask to switch the role. All right. So if you're doing it from the portal directly, you just say, okay, switch role, and that will go ahead and make this STS Assume Role call. Or if you're doing it from CLI, you do it again, and then this STS API Assume Role API is called. So what you need to mention, of course, is what role do you want to assume. You need to know what kind of role you want to assume, and then what is the session name will be there. All right, and that will be used for logging purposes in CloudTrail, and certain time validity, of course, maximum up to 72 hours. You can actually go ahead and have the validity for that particular session or for that particular role. Uh, now, once that is done, IAM first of all checks two things. All right. Now, first of all, if this particular user has the permission to assume a role or not, or to make this API call, that is STS Assume Role. All right. So that has to be in the IAM permission, or there has to be a policy attached to this IAM user that allows him or grants him access to call this API in the first place. All right. Second, the role that he wants to assume, all right, that role should have a trust relationship with the principal, or in this case, that is the IAM user that we're talking about. All right, so these two things has to be there. If these two things are there, both of them, then things will go ahead. Otherwise, there will be no, or there will be an error. All right, and the user will not be able to assume the role. Now, when we talk about role, basically, all right, any role has two things. First of all, you have permissions for that role. All right, obviously, what can someone do? Second thing is trust relationship. All right, so who can actually assume this role? So again, defined by the role trust policy. So you'll have to provide, whenever you're creating this role, that others that you want someone to assume, you'll have to provide who can assume it. All right, so that would be defined in the trust relationship, and in permission you provide the permission of what they can do. And again, these two checks that we mentioned, first of all, the user has access to make the STS call in the first place. Second, the user should be in the trust relationship of the role. If both of these security checks succeed, then the STS provides temporary credentials to the user. All right, and then user can use this temporary credential to make, to perform operations that he wanted. Now this is how the temporary credential looks like. All right, so you have your own long-term credential, that is your access key and secret key. So there are only two. So you can see that access key here starts with the prefix of AKIA. All right, in temporary credentials you will have the access key starting with ASIA. That's what you will see. And again, there will be the secret key, and there will be one more component, that will be a session token, also in the temporary credentials. All right, so we'll actually go ahead and see how exactly this works in the we'll log into the Azure, AWS portal, and we'll see how exactly this works. So we will create an IAM user, of course, and we'll give it some permission. Then we'll create and apply this STS Assume role for that particular user. Then we'll create a new role, of course, that we want to be this user to assume. All right. Then we'll of course add a policy to this particular role with extra privileges so that we can verify that yes, this policy is working. So the privileges that the original user permission does not have, we'll give that to this particular role. And finally, we'll have to add this IAM user in the trust relationship of the role that we have just created. All right, so that is how it will work. Let's go ahead and check the demo in the next lecture. Thank you so much.